Well, I think there's no question that the United States, in large part because of the Israel lobby, has been joined at the hip with Israel. And after October 7th, when the Israelis decided to go on a rampage in Gaza, the United States fully supported the Israelis. Many Israeli generals have made it clear that they could not conduct this offensive against the Palestinians in Gaza without the material support, and here we're talking mainly about weaponry, that the United States is providing them. And furthermore, we're providing them with diplomatic cover. So the United States is complicitous with what Israel is doing in Gaza, and this is hardly surprising given the power of the lobby in the United States.
I wanted to get your reaction to recent events. So we've had many quite significant factors emerge recently. We have the ICC signaling they're likely to issue arrest warrants for Netanyahu and, in addition, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. You have the ICJ just recently issuing yet another injunction, basically saying you cannot go into Rafah. You had Biden sort of weakly signaling this red line and pretending at least like he was going to halt weapons shipments if there was what he described as a quote unquote major invasion of Rafah. You have 3 more European countries coming out and recognizing a Palestinian state. And yet, in spite of all of that, or perhaps because of some of that, you still have the IDF going forward. We saw this horrific massacre of Palestinians who were displaced in a safe zone inside of their tents, at least 45 killed. What do you make of the Israeli calculation at this point and the moment that we're in right now?
Well, just to talk about the Israeli calculation, I think it's important to emphasize that Netanyahu has no real interest in ending the war. The longer the war goes on, the better for him politically, because once the war ends, he'll have to face the music for what happened on October 7th, and he could be pushed overboard. So he has a vested interest in keeping the war going for that reason. Secondly, he's committed to defeating Hamas completely. He's committed to winning a decisive victory. I don't believe for one second that he can do that, but if he's going to attempt to do it, he has to go into Rafah. So to defeat Hamas, in his mind, it's necessary to go into Rafah. Now, with regard to why he did it, given all the international condemnation of Israel's behavior towards the Palestinians in Gaza in general, and especially with regard to what's happening in Rafah, he just doesn't care. It doesn't matter to him what world opinion says one way or the other, as long as the United States backs him, as long as the United States has his back. And Joe Biden has his back, and he knows full well that if Trump gets elected in November, the Trump will have his back as well. So he's free to do whatever he wants. And given that he has a vested interest in continuing this war and trying to defeat Hamas, we go on and on.
Professor, how do you see, in the short term, obviously, they're going to have the back of the U.S. The U.S. is the dominant power in the world. But the increasing isolation of both the United States and Israel, what does that look like for Israel in the medium to long-term future? Are they going to be an international pariah state? How do you see the evolution of the international system with respect to Israel over time?
Well, I think it's very important to emphasize that independent of what's going on in Gaza, Israel is an apartheid state. And here we're talking about Greater Israel, which includes the West Bank and Gaza, which are part of Greater Israel for sure. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization inside of Israel, have all issued lengthy and sophisticated reports that make a compelling case that Israel is an apartheid state. The Israelis are well aware of what happened to South Africa. South Africa was once an apartheid state, and it's no longer an apartheid state because it's very hard to sustain an apartheid state in the modern world. So Israel has real problems moving forward because it's an apartheid state, and it has no way at the moment of getting out of that situation. When you marry that to the fact that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, And by the way, if you don't think Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, you at least have to admit that they're engaged in mass murder and that they're attempting to starve the Palestinians in Gaza. What they're doing in Gaza is absolutely horrible. I would call it a genocide. So what you have here is an apartheid state that's engaged in genocide. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the long-term viability of a state that fits that description? Mm-hmm. And I would argue over the long term, this presents enormous problems for Israel. And one can argue that the survival of Israel will be at stake if it doesn't change its ways.
Could you talk a little bit about how you came to the conclusion that this isn't just a mass slaughter, that it does in fact meet the definition of genocide, and whether you see that determination as being significant?
Well, at first I didn't think it was a genocide. I thought there was no question that the Israelis were inflicting significant punishment on the civilian population of Gaza. And it was clear in the beginning that what they were trying to do was they were trying to ethnically cleanse Gaza. You want to understand that if the Israelis were able to cleanse Gaza, they would solve the apartheid problem. And that's true, of course, with regard to the West Bank as well. If Israel could cleanse Gaza and the West Bank of Palestinians, they would solve the apartheid problem. So I think from the beginning, what the Israelis were doing in Gaza was they were trying to cleanse Gaza. They were trying to drive all the Palestinians out. And the way they tried to do that was by making the place unlivable. So they were killing huge numbers of Palestinians. They were destroying their homes. They were destroying schools. They were destroying cemeteries. They were destroying government buildings. They were destroying mosques. And at a certain point, it became clear, right, that this was genocide, that they were trying to kill an enormous number of people in Gaza for the purposes of cleansing Gaza. And then you marry on top of that the fact that they were starving the population. They were greatly limiting the amount of food and water and fuel and medicine that could come into Gaza. And all of this was for the purpose of making the place unlivable and killing large numbers of Palestinians. And this is what led the International Court of Justice in January to say that there was enough evidence to make a plausible case that Israel was committing genocide. And I think, having looked very carefully at the case, that the evidence is quite clear that this is a genocide.
Professor, what standing has the U.S.-Israel relationship had, what effect has the U.S.-Israel relationship had, especially post-October 7th, on the U.S. standing in the international community and in the world? How negatively do you think it's affected the U.S., and what are the long-term impacts in terms of our own policy and standing?
Well, I think it's done significant damage to our reputation. I think that outside of the West, most people believe that this is a genocide. And again, if you don't believe it's a genocide, it's at least mass murder. This is certainly a crime against humanity, what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. But I think most people outside of the West believe it is a genocide. And I think most people believe correctly that the United States is complicit in this genocide. And the end result is that's going to do enormous damage, not only to Israel's reputation, but to our reputation. Then to take it a step further, as you both know well, the United States privileges the liberal international order, or the rules-based order. We believe that international law, international rules really matter. When you look at how the Israelis are behaving in Gaza and how they react to the ICC and the ICJ and how we support them in their reaction, it's quite clear that we are massive hypocrites when it comes to international law. And this, too, damages the United States. The United States basically created the international liberal order. It has a vested interest in making it work. And what we're doing in our support of Israel is we're undermining the international liberal order. People around the world are actually quite shocked at the extent to which the United States is willing to excuse Israeli behavior when it's in direct violation of international law.
I'm almost afraid to ask the next question, but how do you think this ends? I mean, do they effectively succeed in completing the genocide? Because as you point out, Netanyahu has no interest in ending this war. Joe Biden clearly has no interest in moving away from the unconditional support posture. Donald Trump would be the same, probably without the little bit of liberal hand-wringing that we get from Joe Biden. So how do you see this playing out?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I'm hoping that the shooting stops at some point in the not too distant future. I'm hoping that after the assault on Rafah, the Israelis stop the large-scale offensive military operations in Gaza, and instead they restrict their military operations to small-scale attacks against Hamas. I mean, I'd like to see all the shooting stop, but I think that's highly unlikely. But I'd like to see it become more limited. And I think that what will end up happening here is that the Israelis will end up occupying Gaza for the foreseeable future, and Israel will remain an apartheid state. And the Palestinians, of course, at some time in the future will revolt again. I mean, you want to understand that what happened on October 7th is not the first instance of the Palestinians rebelling against the Israelis. You had the first intifada in 1987, you had the second intifada in 2000, and then you had October 7th. And there were all sorts of mini revolts in between those three important events. And this is what happens when you have an apartheid state. The people who are being dominated, and that, of course, is the Palestinian population, they are going to revolt. And therefore, I think that we can expect to see trouble for as far as the eye can see.
Professor, how do you see the risks of regional conflict if that is going to increase, and then the odds that the U.S. would be dragged along? We talked previously in some of our shows, there's been cross-border fire between the Egyptians and the Israelis. Is there going to be a power vacuum similar to the 1960s and 70s where the Palestinian cause brings a lot of popularity and could invite broader regional conflict? Where do you see that going?
Well, you want to remember that the United States is already fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea as a result of what's going on in Gaza. But the really interesting question has to do with Iran. Now, it's clear from what happened in April. You remember on April 1st, the Israelis struck the Iranian embassy in Damascus, Syria. Yep. And then on April 14th, the Iranians attacked Israel in response. And then on April 19th, Israel launched a very limited strike against Iran. So between April 1st and April 19th, we had this conflict not simply involving Israel and Iran. The United States was involved as well. We were involved in the combat that took place on April 14th when Iran attacked Israel. We shot down about half of the drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles that were aimed at Israel. So we were deeply involved. Now, what does this tell you? If you look carefully, you see that the United States and Iran had no interest in having this conflict take place. It's the Israelis who wanted to drag the Americans into a war with Iran. It's the Israelis who started these events on April 1st when they attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus. Then, after April 1st, the United States and the Iranians went to great lengths to make sure that the conflict did not escalate to the point where you had a war between the United States and Iran. We don't want a wider conflict in the region. We're not happy about the fact that we're fighting the Houthis. We certainly don't want a war with Iran, and we don't want a war with Hezbollah either. And in that case, we've been putting significant pressure on the Israelis not to get into a major league fight with Hezbollah on their northern border, because again, we're afraid that we'll be pulled in. So I think it's very important to understand that there is potential for escalation in the region beyond what's happening in the Israel-Palestine conflict, but that the United States has no interest in seeing itself get dragged into another forever war. And therefore, I think it is unlikely that we will end up fighting against Iran in the foreseeable future.
Do you see any Israeli domestic political considerations that could, and pressures that could lead to some sort of a ceasefire agreement in the short term? You had both Benny Gantz and Yoav Gallant coming out, Gantz specifically issuing these series of ultimatums. Looks like he's preparing to exit the war cabinet on June 8th. You have massive protests. You know, there isn't a lot of disagreement about the prosecution of the war, the treatment of Palestinian civilians per se, but there is massive friction over the pursuit of a hostage deal. Do you think that any of those things could bring this conflict to a close, at least the micro conflict that's being engaged in right now?
Well, as you point out, there are, very powerful centrifugal forces inside of Israel that threaten the Netanyahu government and at first glance appear to push in the direction of some sort of ceasefire. But I would just say that if you watch Benjamin Netanyahu in action, he is something of a magician when it comes to maintaining his position in power. There's no question that, his war cabinet is deeply unhappy with the fact that he has no plan for how to run Gaza once the shooting stops. It's very clear that the hostage problem is causing him enormous trouble. But again, he is something of a magician, and I would not bet a lot of money that he's toppled anytime soon. I would also note that if he is toppled, it won't matter that much. The fact is that, Netanyahu is not an outlier here. Many liberal American Jews like to make the argument that the real problem here is Benjamin Netanyahu, and if only we can get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu, we'll live happily ever after. I think this is not the case. I think that Netanyahu has views that are, similar to Benny Gantz's views, similar to Yoav Gallant's views. I mean, he's not an outlier. And in fact, if you look at his entire cabinet, he has a number of people who are far to the right of him. He looks like a centrist in the context of his own cabinet. The fact is that Israel is a remarkably hawkish state. The Israel that I knew when I was a young boy and a young man has gone away. It's moved steadily to the right over time. And I believe with the passage of time, it will move even further and further to the right. This is a hawkish country that has extreme